In April 1940, the Temmler company Werke delivered more than 35 million methamphetamine tablets to the German army. They weren't part of a medical treatment. They were chemical munitions for blitzkrieg. In the preceding months, the pill had been massively tested on the civilian population. Workers, housewives, and students took Pervitin without a prescription. Advertisements promised inexhaustible energy, total alertness, and limitless productivity. On the front lines, pilots, tankers, and infantrymen received regular doses to fight without pause. The adverse effects were already known, but were ignored. The priority was to maintain the offensive. Why was its mass distribution allowed, even after the first overdose deaths? How did this drug influence the physical and psychological collapse of the German army? And what mechanisms prevented the system from halting a catastrophe that had already been documented? Pervitin, the drug that seduced Germany before the war. In late 1930s, Germany, as the Nazi regime consolidated its power, a small white pill began to circulate among the population. Pervitin, the first brand name for methamphetamine in Europe, a compound that promised to transform the limits of the body and mind. The Japanese chemist Nagayoshi Nagai had first synthesized methamphetamine in 1893 from ephedrine. However, it was in Temmler's German laboratories Werke where in 1937 chemist Fritz Hauschild perfected a stable and economical formulation for industrial production. Temmler registered the patent and began marketing Pervitin in 3 mg tablets of methamphetamine hydrochloride. Pervitin's pharmacology produced almost immediate and powerful effects on the central nervous system, markedly increased concentration, reduced appetite, heightened alertness, a feeling of euphoria, and seemingly endless physical and mental energy. In the short term, it eliminated feelings of fatigue and fear, creating an artificial sense of confidence and suppressing the need for sleep. However, this initial phase was inevitably followed by a period of profound exhaustion, where the cumulative effects of sleep deprivation and overexertion manifested suddenly, often with devastating consequences for the body. With prolonged use, it caused both physical and psychological dependence. Tolerance increased rapidly, requiring increasingly higher doses to achieve the same effects. Chronic use could trigger paranoia, hallucinations, erratic behavior, and, in extreme cases, toxic psychosis. Abrupt withdrawal after continued use produced severe depression, extreme fatigue, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. The launch of Pervitin coincided with a particular moment in German history. The Nazi regime had reduced unemployment and inflation at the cost of unprecedented economic and productive pressure. The entire nation was being mobilized for industrial production and military readiness. In this constant demand, a pill that promised to eliminate fatigue and increase productivity fit perfectly with the regime's ambitions. Temmler's advertising campaign was innovative and aggressive. The ads invaded the mainstream press, workplaces, and even women's magazines with messages like, "Pervitin keeps you awake, activates your thinking, and creates an optimal state of efficiency," or "Pervitin for those days when you need to get everything done." For German housewives, overwhelmed by domestic responsibilities, a particularly seductive variant emerged, Hausfrau Schokolade, housewife's chocolate, which combined methamphetamine with chocolate and caffeine. University students discovered that Pervitin allowed them to study for all night, without a break. In factories and offices, workers and clerks used it to maintain the frenetic pace demanded by Germany's militarized economy. The Nazi regime, far from discouraging this mass consumption, observed it with interest. The culture of constant effort, the willingness to sacrifice, and productivity at any cost were values exalted by National Socialism. A citizen who worked tirelessly thanks to chemical stimulants was a functional citizen for the system. Pervitin was sold without a prescription. Any German could purchase it at a pharmacy as easily as they could buy aspirin. This accessibility, coupled with aggressive advertising and the absence of warnings about adverse effects, led to widespread consumption. Temmler's internal files reveal that in 1939 alone, before the official outbreak of war, approximately 5 million Pervitin tablets were sold to the German civilian public. This normalization of consumption initially found support among certain medical circles. Some doctors believed that, unlike other stimulants like cocaine, Pervitin seemed to offer clean energy without the agitation and mood swings that are common. Medical journals published studies, many funded by Temmler herself, that highlighted its benefits and downplayed its side effects. However, as early as 1938, the first warning signs began to appear in hospitals and clinics. Patients who had been taking Pervitin for weeks were experiencing worrying symptoms: chronic insomnia, cardiac arrhythmias, uncontrollable tremors, episodes of paranoia, and anxiety attacks. Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk, a nutritionist linked to the SS, documented cases of what he called compulsive consumption, a term that avoided the word addiction but described the same phenomenon. The University of Leipzig archives record the testimony of a young secretary hospitalized after a nervous breakdown in 1939. "At first, I thought I was becoming more efficient and faster, but after 3 weeks of barely any sleep, I began to see shadows moving in the corners of my room. I heard voices speaking to me when I was alone. I was certain I was being watched." Pervitin's military potential. In 1939, Dr. Otto Friedrich Ranke, director of the Institute of Military Physiology, conducted systematic studies with groups of university students, measuring their resistance to fatigue, concentration, and reaction time under the influence of methamphetamine. Their findings were decisive. Pervitin not only eliminated drowsiness and improved reflexes, but also temporarily reduced the sensation of fear and the perception of pain. For an army planning a war involving rapid movement and continuous action, these properties were extremely valuable. The ideological context of Nazism favored the acceptance of Pervitin. The regime exalted the will to power, individual sacrifice for the collective cause, and a specific concept of the body, an instrument at the service of the state that should function with the precision of a machine. Official propaganda linked physical strength with racial purity and moral superiority. Tiredness and fatigue could be interpreted almost as moral weaknesses or failures in the face of national duty. Pervitin offered a chemical solution to this demand for superhuman performance. By late 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and formally initiated World War II, civilian use of Pervitin had unwittingly fulfilled a crucial function. It had served as a gigantic test experiment for what was to come. Millions of Germans had experienced its effects, generating a body of empirical data on dosage, effects, and limitations. The Reich Health Office, concerned by increasing reports of adverse effects, began considering restrictions on the over-the-counter sale of Pervitin. In December 1939, an internal circular was issued to pharmacies requesting that they record mass sales. However, these measures were too late and insufficient, given the magnitude of the phenomenon. By then, military interest in the substance had grown exponentially. The Wehrmacht had not only taken note of Pervitin's stimulant effects, but was already planning its systematic incorporation into war logistics. Doped Blitzkrieg. How methamphetamine fueled the Blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions crossed the Polish border in September 1939. They implemented a military strategy that would baffle the world: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This revolutionary tactic combined air attacks, mechanized units, and coordinated advances at unprecedented speed. What few knew at the time was that behind this seemingly superhuman ability to maintain the offensive thrust day and night lay an invisible but decisive factor: millions of Pervitin tablets systematically distributed among German troops. The incorporation of Pervitin into the German arsenal was the result of a methodical scientific evaluation led by Dr. Otto Friedrich Ranke, director of the Institute of Military Physiology. A specialist in neurophysiology, Ranke thoroughly understood the mechanisms of action of stimulants on the central nervous system. In the spring of 1939, Ranke began systematic testing of Pervitin in controlled environments, assessing reaction times, fatigue resistance, and the ability to perform complex calculations under simulated stress. In his internal reports, he called Pervitin a highly effective combat stimulant and, more significantly, a substance that transforms ordinary men into extraordinary soldiers and a chemical weapon for psychic combat. In July 1939, Ranke presented his findings to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the High Command of the German Armed Forces. The reception was enthusiastic, especially among officers attached to the motorized divisions. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of modern mechanized warfare, saw in Pervitin a solution to one of the main challenges of blitzkrieg: human fatigue. The strategy of blitzkrieg depended on speed and continuity of operations. Unlike the positional warfare of 1914 to 1918, the new German doctrine called for deep penetrations, continuous advances, and uninterrupted offensive pressure. Mechanized vehicles could function as long as they had fuel, but their human operators faced inevitable biological limitations: the need for sleep, recovery times, and declines in concentration after hours of combat. Although the Polish campaign of September 1939 did not require widespread use of stimulants due to overwhelming German superiority, limited trials were conducted in specific units. Luftwaffe pilots and the crews of some panzer battalions received small quantities of Pervitin for night or exceptionally long missions. An internal medical report of the 10th Panzer Division, dated 27 September 1939, describes how a company that had received Pervitin managed to maintain the advance for 36 uninterrupted hours, traversing difficult terrain without showing any signs of significant fatigue. The report concluded the controlled use of the stimulant made it possible to maintain operational continuity under conditions that would otherwise have required personnel rotations. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, as the Western offensive against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands was being prepared, the decision was made to incorporate methamphetamine as an integral part of the logistical plan. Temla-Werk, the civilian manufacturer, received priority production orders from the War Ministry. By April 1940, weeks before the start of the Western Offensive, Temla had delivered more than 35 million Pervitin tablets intended exclusively for military use. The distribution was not random. Priority was given to the frontline units, those that would maintain the initial offensive momentum and penetrate deep into enemy territory. Pervitin tablets upon beginning operations expected to be prolonged. Additional doses could be administered when circumstances required extending the activity beyond 24 hours. The tablets came in small metal containers labeled Tabletten, tablets, left Leistungssteigerung, performance-enhancing tablets. Among soldiers, Pervitin quickly acquired informal names. Pilots called it Stuka-Tablets, a reference to the Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers. Tank crews nicknamed it Panzerschokolade, tanker chocolate, while infantrymen used terms like Wunderpillen, wonder pills, or simply Hermann Göring pills. The decisive moment to assess the military effectiveness of the Pervitin came in May 1940 with the launch of the Western Offensive. The German plan, which surprised Allied strategists, contemplated a massive advance through the Ardennes, a rugged, wooded area considered by the French to be virtually impenetrable to mechanized formations. Panzer divisions assigned to the initial breakthrough received special supplies of methamphetamine. For the first 3 days of the offensive, they made a virtually uninterrupted advance. The crews operated in minimal shifts, kept artificially alert by regular doses of Pervitin. The tank and logistical support vehicle drivers advanced day and night following narrow forest roads, with a concentration that surprised even their own officers. Panzer Battalion Commander wrote in his operations diary, "Our men have gone 48 hours without proper sleep, yet their driving and firing accuracy have not significantly diminished. The chemical stimulation method is proving to be undeniably effective tactically." The result was a lightning breakthrough that exceeded all expectations. In just 3 days, the panzer divisions had completely traversed the Ardennes and reached the banks of the Meuse River near Sedan. The speed of the advance was such that French reconnaissance units could barely report a breakthrough at one point when the German armoured vehicles had already advanced dozens of kilometres further. The Battle of France, which Allied strategists had envisioned as a protracted repeat of the First World War, was decided in a matter of weeks. The panzer divisions, operating in an artificial state of activity sustained by methamphetamines, made such deep penetrations that they threatened the Channel ports before the bulk of the Anglo-French forces could reorganize their defenses. Despite warnings from some military doctors who were beginning to experience worrying effects, the High Command's overall assessment was positive. The speed and depth of the German advance had exceeded all expectations, creating strategic panic within the Allied command. Operational continuity, largely sustained by the systematic use of Pervitin, was considered a decisive factor in this success. Dr. Otto Ranke wrote a triumphant report to the Army High Command in July 1940, following the French surrender, in which he stated, "Modern warfare has definitively incorporated a pharmacological dimension. The ability to maintain the continuous operational readiness of forward-deployed units through controlled stimulation has proven to be a multiplier of tactical effectiveness. We strongly recommend the permanent integration of the Pervitin compound into the logistics planning of future operations, especially those requiring deep penetrations and continuous movement." What Ranke failed to emphasize was the growing evidence of significant side effects. Some field doctors had documented disturbing cases, soldiers who, after prolonged periods on Pervitin, experienced psychotic episodes, severe cardiac arrhythmias, or states of extreme confusion. These cases, however, were considered exceptional or attributed to individual predispositions, not to the drug itself. At a deeper level, the military use of methamphetamines revealed a disturbing aspect of the Nazi mentality: the mechanistic view of the human body as an instrument of state power that could and should be chemically optimized to maximize its operational effectiveness. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactical revolution, it was also the first systematic and large-scale use of neuropharmacology as a force multiplier in a modern conflict. What began as an initial strategic advantage would soon reveal its dark side in the form of mass addiction, physical collapse, and psychosis among troops. Addiction, collapse, and psychosis in the ranks of the Reich. Following the fall of France in June 1940, the Third Reich reached the height of its territorial expansion in Western Europe. The German military machine seemed invincible. However, this invincibility was beginning to show internal cracks invisible to outside observers, but increasingly evident to the Wehrmacht's medical officers. The first systematic reports of problems related to long-term use of Pervitin began to reach the High Command in late summer 1940. Dr. Helmuth Unger, a medical lieutenant assigned to a field hospital in occupied France, compiled observations on soldiers who had received regular doses during the May-June offensive. His report described an alarming pattern he termed a psychophysical disintegration phase. Kriegsmarine Submariner wrote in a personal letter, later confiscated, "I can no longer distinguish between what I can do on my own and what I can do thanks to the pills. Without them I feel slow, stupid, vulnerable. I fear that without Pervitin, I won't be the sailor I should be. I won't be fast enough, alert enough, and that could cost my comrades their lives." This psychological dependence was combined with a growing drug tolerance. Regular users required increasingly larger doses to experience the same effects. When administration was discontinued, severe withdrawal symptoms appeared: deep depression, paralyzing exhaustion, suicidal ideation, uncontrollable anxiety, and, in extreme cases, violent impulses. Dr. Gunther Weitbrecht, a military psychiatrist, documented a particularly disturbing incident in the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion. 2 soldiers who had been regularly administered Pervitin violently attacked their sergeant when he informed them that there was no more available supply. One bit a comrade who tried to intervene, while the other smashed his rifle on the ground, claiming that it contained bugged microphones that transmitted his thoughts to the enemy. The logistics of Pervitin distribution, initially carried out with military precision, began to show significant flaws. Although official protocols stipulated that administration should be carried out exclusively under medical supervision, the reality at the front was very different. Many commanders distributed the pills based on purely operational criteria, ignoring medical recommendations. This lack of medical supervision exacerbated all the problems. Some soldiers reached high levels of toxicity due to unnoticed overdoses. Others, anticipating shortages, stockpiled tablets, eventually ingesting massive doses that triggered acute intoxication. Wehrmacht internal medical records documented at least 12 deaths directly attributable to Pervitin overdoses, although contemporary medical historians consider this figure significantly underestimated. The most notorious case was that of Stuka bomber pilot Lieutenant Karl-Heinz G., who ingested 7 tablets before a mission over England in November 1940. During the flight, he suffered cardiac arrest, which led to his aircraft crashing near Calais. An autopsy revealed extreme levels of methamphetamine in his blood and cardiac damage consistent with stimulant toxicity. Ironically, one of the first to warn about the risks was Dr. Otto Ranke, the same man who had pushed for its adoption as a military stimulant. In September 1941, Ranke sent a confidential memorandum to the High Command warning, "Uncontrolled abuse of Pervitin can completely neutralize the operational advantages initially gained. We are seeing cases of chronic toxicity that permanently disable veteran soldiers whose experience is irreplaceable. It is imperative to re-establish strict medical administration protocols." This belated warning met with little receptivity from a high command obsessed with maintaining the strategic initiative at all costs. Particularly devastating were the withdrawal symptoms in soldiers who had received Pervitin regularly and were then transferred to units where the supply was irregular or non-existent. This severe dependence not only degraded individual combat capability, but also began to affect the cohesion of entire units. Disciplinary records show a significant increase in Pervitin-related incidents. Theft of medical supplies, clashes between soldiers over leftover doses, temporary desertions to seek pills in other units, and even attacks on medical personnel. In the 7th Panzer Division, a case was documented of a corporal who set up a barter system where he exchanged pills stolen from the first aid kit for cigarettes, chocolate, and alcohol. When discovered, he claimed he was providing an essential service for the maintenance of morale. More serious was the incident in a reconnaissance battalion on the Eastern Front. 5 veteran soldiers attacked their unit's doctor when he refused to give them Pervitin. The disciplinary report concluded discipline had completely collapsed. The men acted like common addicts, not like soldiers of the Reich. The campaign against the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, elevated all these challenges to an unprecedented scale. The eastward offensive, initially planned as another rapid blitzkrieg, turned into a war of attrition, with German troops facing extreme conditions, freezing, cold, overstretched supply lines, fierce resistance, and the vastness of Russia's geography. Pervitin, which had worked relatively well in the short, intense campaigns in Western Europe, showed its limitations in a protracted war. Soldiers given methamphetamines to sustain the initial offensive suffered devastating collapses days later, just as conditions at the front became more demanding. Major Kurt von Moltke, medical officer in the 6th Infantry Division, wrote in his diary in November 1941, "The men boosted with Pervitin for the advance toward Moscow are now useless, precisely when we need them most. They are experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, and fatigue so profound that some cannot leave their shelters. This drug has given us an initial tactical advantage, which we are paying for strategically in the form of non-combat casualties." In December 1941, the mounting evidence of adverse effects finally prompted an institutional response. The Reich Ministry of Health officially reclassified methamphetamine as a controlled narcotic, subjecting it to restrictions similar to those regulating opiates. This administrative measure, however, came too late and was practically unenforceable in the chaotic conditions at the front, especially in Russia. Dr. Leonardo Conti, Reich Secretary of Public Health, issued a memorandum in February 1942 in which he implicitly recognized the seriousness of the problem. The use of stimulants such as Pervitin should be strictly restricted to situations of immediate tactical necessity under qualified medical supervision and for periods not exceeding 48 hours. Under no circumstances should it be used as a prolonged strategy for maintaining the operational status of units. This directive, although technically sound, came after thousands of soldiers had already developed severe addictions. The long-term consequences were devastating. In addition to the hundreds who died directly from toxic effects or circumstances resulting from the poisoning, thousands were left with permanent after-effects. A unit dedicated exclusively to treating methamphetamine-induced neurological damage was established at the Leipzig Military Hospital in 1942. Patients presented with persistent cognitive impairments, inability to concentrate, short-term memory loss, extreme emotional lability, nervous tics, and recurrent psychotic episodes. Unlike other war neuroses, these disorders rarely responded to conventional therapies. German Red Cross documents compiled between 1942 and 1945 estimated that more than 12,000 veterans were admitted to psychiatric institutions with diagnoses directly or indirectly related to stimulant use. For many, these confinements became permanent. The history of Pervitin in the Wehrmacht represents one of the first experiments in chemical modification of combatants on a mass scale. What had begun as a tactical resource to enhance the blitzkrieg became, in just 2 years, a health and disciplinary problem of enormous proportions that contributed to the internal deterioration of the German army long before its defeats on the battlefield. The drugged SS, sadism, opioids, and extermination under the influence of Pervitin. While the Wehrmacht was dealing with the adverse effects of widespread stimulant use on the front lines, another, even darker chapter was unfolding in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. Thousands of SS Schutzstaffel officers and guards ran the concentration camp system and carried out mass extermination operations under the systematic influence of lethal combinations of drugs, primarily Pervitin and opioids. The Schutzstaffel, or SAS, was not a conventional military force. Originally founded as Hitler's personal guard, it evolved under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler to become the ideological and operational core of the Nazi terror apparatus. This organization, which required its members to prove their racial purity and swear an oath of absolute loyalty, was responsible for internal police control, the administration of concentration camps, and from 1941, the industrial implementation of the final solution. What distinguished the SS was its combination of ideological fanaticism and bureaucratic efficiency. Not only did they pursue and murder out of conviction, but they had developed a complex administrative system to process extermination as an industrial operation, with records, standardized procedures, and defined chains of command. Keeping this machinery of death running posed an unprecedented psychological challenge. Even the most indoctrinated members struggled to sustain direct participation in mass murder over extended periods. Historical documentation suggests that to meet this challenge, the SS systematically resorted to the use of psychoactive substances. Internal medical reports from the SS Sanitätsamt, SS Medical Department, reveal that by 1942, approximately one-third of officers assigned to concentration camps and execution units, Einsatzgruppen, regularly consumed some form of psychoactive substance. Unlike the Wehrmacht, where Pervitin was primarily used to combat physical fatigue, in the SS the consumption pattern responded to more complex needs. Blocking natural empathy, facilitating the emotional disconnection necessary for extermination tasks, and managing traumatic stress derived from participation in systematic atrocities, Pervitin and opioids were used in a complementary manner, creating what some SS doctors called operative chemical equilibrium. Methamphetamine provided physical energy, reduced moral inhibitions, and generated a state of hyperarousal that facilitated the unquestioning execution of orders. Opioids, mainly morphine and synthetic derivatives, induced a state of emotional detachment, reduced anxiety, and partially blocked the formation of traumatic memories. This deliberate use of substances to facilitate extermination represents one of the most perverse manifestations of Nazi pharmacological instrumentalization. It was no longer a matter of enhancing the fighting capacity of conventional soldiers, but rather of creating chemically modified executioners capable of killing without physical or psychological limits. The perversion of medical science reached its most abject expression in the drug experiments carried out in the concentration camps. At Auschwitz, under the supervision of doctors such as Karl Klauberg and Edward Wirths, systematic experiments were conducted to determine the limits of human endurance under different combinations of drugs, sensory deprivation, and extreme physical stress. Some prisoners were given high doses of Pervitin and then subjected to physical endurance tests until they completely collapsed. Others were kept awake with stimulants for periods that could extend beyond a week. At Dachau, SS Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted experiments combining exposure to extreme temperatures with the administration of stimulants. Prisoners were submerged in tanks of ice-cold water until they approached fatal hypothermia. Then some were given Pervitin injections to determine whether the stimulants could reverse the hypothermic collapse. Virtually all of these experiments ended in the death of the subjects, either from the direct effects of the drugs, from organic collapse, or from subsequent execution for post-mortem studies. The medical documentation of these crimes, with the technical precision typical of scientific reports, reveals the extent to which Nazi ideology had completely dehumanized its victims. Drug use played a systematic role in the daily operations of the camps. Wardens and officers responsible for overseeing mass executions, selections for the gas chambers, and torture interrogations regularly received doses of Pervitin, supplemented with alcohol and, in many cases, opiates. At Majdanek, a guard identified as SS Rottenführer Hans W. was temporarily suspended after suffering a psychotic episode during a night watch in the autumn of 1943. According to the internal report, he opened fire on his own shadow projected by the perimeter searchlights, convinced that he was an infiltrator. He then attempted to scale the electrified barbed wire, claiming that the trees in the forest were giving him orders. After being subdued, he was taken to a military hospital where he was diagnosed with acute toxic psychosis due to stimulant abuse. Stutthof camp in December 1943. 4 SS guards who had consumed massive doses of Pervitin organized an unauthorized selection among the prisoners in the infirmary block. They executed more than 40 inmates, mainly elderly and sick, claiming they were planning an insurrection. Subsequent investigations determined that there was no evidence of such a plan. The guards had acted under the influence of paranoid hallucinations induced by the poisoning. The camp commandant, in reporting the incident, requested greater control over the dispensing of stimulants to guard personnel. This request reflected a disturbing reality. By 1943, dysfunctional drug use among concentration camp personnel had reached levels that were beginning to interfere with the very efficiency of the extermination process. The increasing pace of mass deportations and executions, especially beginning in 1943, made it virtually impossible to implement effective control measures. By then, many SS officers and guards could no longer function without their regular doses of stimulants and sedatives. Göttingen Military Psychiatric Hospital, reopened and studied by medical historians after the war, revealed that between 1944 and 1946, at least 170 former SS officers were admitted with diagnoses directly related to chronic substance abuse. Many had been assigned to concentration camps and execution units. One such case was that of Dr. Hans Münch, an SS doctor at Auschwitz who developed a severe dependence on morphine and Pervitin during his service there. After liberation, he was briefly hospitalized with a diagnosis of drug-induced amnestic disorder characterized by significant memory loss and disorientation. The combination of ideological fanaticism, absolute power, and continuous chemical alteration created an environment in the extermination camps where brutality reached levels unimaginable. Guards and officers under the influence of methamphetamines could remain awake for days, overseeing continuous executions without showing any signs of fatigue or moral distress. When the stimulant effects began to wear off, they would turn to opioids to induce a state of emotional indifference before restarting the cycle. This pharmacological modulation of consciousness was not merely a side effect of the stress associated with mass extermination, but an integral part of the mechanism that made it possible on an industrial scale. The mass consumption of stimulants and opioids in the SS was not a marginal phenomenon or the result of isolated individual decisions, but a structural component of the Nazi extermination apparatus, a mechanism for overcoming the natural psychological barriers that limit the human capacity to carry out acts of extreme cruelty. The intoxicated Führer, Hitler, and the 80 drugs of Theodor Morell. While millions of soldiers were receiving methamphetamines and SS officers were combining stimulants and opioids to carry out the Holocaust, another unprecedented pharmacological experiment was unfolding at the very center of Nazi power. Adolf Hitler, the man who had unleashed the most devastating war in history, lived on a medication regimen so extreme and chaotic that many medical historians consider it a unique case of chronic polyintoxication in a head of state. The architect of this chemical bubble was Dr. Theodor Morell, a physician whose unorthodox practices had kept him on the fringes of the German medical community until fortuitous circumstances brought him into contact with the Nazi leader. Hitler's relationship with Morell began in 1936, well before the war. The Führer's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, suggested that Hitler consult this doctor to treat his increasing digestive problems, probably linked to chronic irritable bowel syndrome. These disorders had resisted conventional treatments and caused Hitler severe abdominal pain, chronic flatulence, and bouts of diarrhea that interfered with his official duties. Morell, running a private clinic in Berlin, had developed a therapeutic approach that combined orthodox medical procedures with alternative treatments that included experimental supplements, massive doses of synthetic vitamins, and hormonal preparations. The first treatment he administered to Hitler was a gut bacteria cure called Mutaflor, based on non-pathogenic strains of E. coli accompanied by vitamins and digestive supplements. Hitler experienced marked improvement within weeks, which gave him complete trust in Morell. In 1938, Hitler appointed him his official personal physician, granting him unlimited access and exclusive medical authority. Other doctors in the Führer's entourage, including rigorously trained military doctors like Dr. Karl Brandt, were gradually sidelined or limited to occasional consultations. The early years of this doctor-patient relationship were relatively conventional. Morell administered vitamin supplements, digestive aids, and occasionally mild sedatives. However, beginning in 1941, coinciding with the increased stress generated by the war, this dynamic began to radically transform. In July 1941, shortly after the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler suffered a bout of extreme fatigue combined with tremors and profuse sweating. Morell introduced regular injections of glucose, B vitamins, and animal liver extracts. Hitler, impressed by the immediate stimulating effects, requested increasingly frequent treatments. This was the beginning of a pattern that would intensify over the next 4 years. Morell began administering daily injections, first once a day, then morning and evening, eventually building up to 3 or 4 injections a day. Every symptom, every complaint, every fluctuation in energy or mood was addressed with a new injection or pill. Morell's medical diaries, recovered after the war, reveal that between 1941 and April 1945, Hitler received at least 82 different pharmaceutical preparations, many in potentially dangerous combinations and almost all in doses that significantly exceeded standard clinical recommendations. This pharmacological arsenal included stimulants such as Pervitin, methamphetamine, although Morell often used code names like vitamin X or special compound. Methamphetamine was administered primarily during times of extreme fatigue or before diplomatic meetings and important speeches. Supplementing these stimulants were injections of concentrated caffeine, microdoses of strychnine, then promoted as a revitalizer, and preparations of choramine, a cardiorespiratory stimulant. Paradoxically, alongside this stimulant regimen, Hitler was receiving significant quantities of opioids and sedatives. The most notable was Eucodal, oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opium derivative with a potency similar to morphine. Morell began administering it in 1943, initially to treat intestinal spasms, but it soon became a regular component of his regimen. In addition, Hitler received barbiturates such as veronal and potassium bromide to induce sleep, as well as preparations of scopolamine and atropine, substances with anticholinergic effects that can produce dissociative states. Particularly disturbing was the extensive use of hormones and animal extracts. Morell administered testosterone and other anabolic steroids, initially to treat chronic fatigue, but later as part of a regular regimen. These were supplemented with extracts from young bull testicles, liver, heart, and even animal brain, based on the pseudo-scientific theory that these organs contained vital principles transferable by injection. This extreme and continued polypharmacy had devastating effects on Hitler's health. The first obvious signs of deterioration began to appear in 1943. Coinciding with the first significant military defeats on the Eastern Front and the start of Allied bombing raids on Germany. By 1944, his physical deterioration was impossible to conceal. Film footage of the meetings at the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, shows a clearly ill man. His left hand trembles constantly to the point where he holds it pressed against his body or hides it behind his back. His gait is unsteady, with his left foot dragging slightly. His voice fluctuates between barely audible whispers and unpredictable bursts of volume. Beginning in 1943 and accelerating rapidly in 1944, Hitler seemed to oscillate between disconcerting extremes. Some days he would appear at military meetings with feverish energy, constantly interrupting the generals, talking non-stop for hours and rejecting any opposing opinion with unusual vehemence. Other days he seemed a completely different man, apathetic, with a blank stare, barely able to keep track of the conversation. On these occasions he could remain silent for hours, as if absent, only to suddenly perk up after receiving one of Dr. Morell's frequent injections. For the last 2 years, the Führer could not begin any activity without first receiving his morning injection. He would visibly tremble until the needle entered his arm. He would often say to me, "Ling, you know I can't function without my medicine." Sessions with Morell became more frequent. Sometimes the doctor would come in as many as 4 or 5 times a day with his bag. Hitler's neurological deterioration has been the subject of intense medical debate. Numerous neurologists have suggested, based on available film footage and testimonies, that he developed Parkinsonian syndrome, possibly related to chronic use of methamphetamines and other stimulants, which can deplete the brain's dopamine reserves and cause symptoms similar to Parkinson's disease. The most notorious example was his decision to categorically prohibit the withdrawal of the Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43, condemning more than 200,000 German soldiers to death or Soviet captivity. Generals present at the meetings where this decision was made describe Hitler as being in a state of extreme agitation, alternating periods of irrational optimism with outbursts of rage at any suggestion to the contrary. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff in the final years of the war, recorded in his memoirs how strategic meetings had become virtually impossible. The Führer no longer made decisions based on logical analysis or objective assessments of the military situation. He seemed to operate in a parallel reality, where destroyed divisions remained operational, where reserves existed that had been wiped out months before, and where the basic laws of logistics and geography could be overridden by acts of will. This growing detachment from reality coincided with periods of increased drug use. According to testimony from officers present at military meetings, Hitler often received Morell injections just before important strategic sessions, apparently to maintain alertness and energy. Morell, aware of his patient's deterioration, does not appear to have attempted to modify his therapeutic approach. On the contrary, his medical diaries show a pattern of constant escalation, adding new drugs and increasing the doses of those already prescribed when the desired effects diminished due to drug tolerance. Hitler's inner circle began to express growing concerns about Morell's influence. Several high-ranking officers unsuccessfully attempted to convince Hitler to seek a second medical opinion. Dr. Karl Brandt himself explicitly warned about the risks of the drug regimen. These warnings were either ignored or interpreted by Hitler as evidence of plots against him. The final weeks of the war, with Hitler holed up in the bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, represented the nadir of this pharmacological experiment. By then, his physical condition was deplorable. The few recordings and images available show a man aged beyond his 56 years, with constant tremors, a hunched posture, a blank stare, and evident cognitive decline. According to accounts from the bunker's last inhabitants, Hitler alternated between periods of profound apathy and bursts of irrational optimism, insisting that the German army could still counterattack and turn the situation around. He ordered the movement of non-existent divisions and discussed plans for a spring offensive, even as Soviet troops were already bombarding the Chancellery. On April 22, 1945, just 8 days before his suicide, Hitler suffered a nervous breakdown during a meeting when he was informed that a counteroffensive he had ordered could not be carried out due to a complete lack of resources. After an outburst of rage accusing the entire High Command of treason, he suffered what witnesses described as a near-total physical collapse. Shaking uncontrollably and barely able to stand, he demanded a special injection from Morell to regain control. Shortly after, Hitler dismissed Morell from the bunker, supposedly because his shaky hands could no longer administer injections accurately. The doctor left Berlin on April 23rd, but was later captured by American forces. Hitler's final week, now without Morell's pharmacological support, witnessed accelerated deterioration. Abruptly deprived of the substances he had relied on for years, he likely experienced multiple withdrawal symptoms complicated by the extreme stress of the catastrophic military situation. On April 30, 1945, after receiving confirmation of Mussolini's death, Hitler committed suicide with Eva Braun in his bunker. Her body was partially burned in the Chancellery Garden, as directed, and later recovered by Soviet troops. Hitler's drug addiction raises disturbing questions about the intersection between altered brain chemistry and absolute political power. Without falling into simplistic determinism, it is impossible to ignore that many of the Third Reich's most catastrophic military and political decisions coincided with the period of its leader's peak drug addiction. The story of Hitler and Morell represents perhaps the most extreme experiment in chemical modification of a head of state during the active exercise of power. Its consequences transcend the medical field to enter the broader realm of how altered states of consciousness can influence historical decision-making, especially in regimes where power is excessively concentrated in a single individual. The Reich's toxic legacy, what remains of the Nazi laboratory. When Allied forces finally penetrated the heart of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945, they discovered horrors that defied human understanding. The liberated concentration camps revealed the industrial scale of Nazi genocide. However, among the rubble of this collapsed empire, there was another, less visible but equally disturbing legacy: the vast pharmacological experimentation that had turned much of the Nazi military and extermination apparatus into a chemical laboratory for human modification. This legacy, unlike the fields or the weapons, could not simply be dismantled. It consisted of knowledge, techniques, compounds, and data that would survive the fall of the regime that developed them, raising troubling questions about scientific ethics, medical liability, and the limits of chemical intervention in humans for decades to come. Allied military investigators were the first to confront this legacy. Examining confiscated documents, they found evidence of unprecedented stimulant use. Temler's records work showed the production and distribution of over 35 million Pervitin tablets for the French campaign in 1940, with similar figures for later operations. For Allied intelligence services, these discoveries represented a potential strategic resource. During the Cold War, Nazi pharmacological knowledge was an asset that could be exploited or, worse still, acquired by the Soviet bloc. This pragmatic concern drove operations like Paperclip, through which US intelligence recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, technicians, and doctors, including some linked to the Nazi regime. Although the best-known names were figures like Werner von Braun, the list also included experts in pharmacology, neurochemistry, and behavior modification. The case of Dr. Kurt Blohm is particularly illustrative. During the Nazi regime, Blohm had directed the biological warfare research program and participated in experiments with neurotoxic compounds on prisoners. Despite being prosecuted at Nuremberg, he was acquitted due to lack of conclusive evidence. Many documents have been destroyed, and subsequently hired as a consultant by Camp Detrick, the US Army's Biological Warfare Research Center. Meanwhile, methamphetamine, the main component of Pervitin, did not disappear with the fall of the Reich. On the contrary, it underwent a commercial transformation and geographic expansion that would take it to new markets under different names. In the United States, Obitrol Pharmaceuticals began marketing a product called Obitrol for the treatment of obesity in the 1950s. This drug contained a mixture of different amphetamine and methamphetamine salts chemically similar to Pervitin, although presented in a completely different medical context. The ads promoted Obitrol as a scientific solution for weight control, emphasizing its ability to curb appetite and increase energy. Sophisticated advertising campaigns aimed primarily at middle-class women presented the product as a modern weight management aid, avoiding any mention of its stimulant properties or addictive potential. Obitrol was a commercial success for over a decade. Its primary users were women concerned about their weight, but it soon found other niches: students seeking to improve their academic performance, professionals working grueling shifts, and even civilian pilots and long-distance drivers. The historical irony is evident. The same substance that had fueled the Blitzkrieg and facilitated the operation of the Nazi extermination machine was now available, with minor modifications, in American pharmacies by routine prescription. This situation partially changed in the 1970s, when growing public concern about amphetamine abuse led the FDA to review previously approved drugs. Obitrol lost its marketing authorization as a combination drug that included methamphetamine in 1973. However, the product transformed rather than disappeared. Richwood Pharmaceuticals, the company that had acquired Obitrol, reformulated the drug, removing the methamphetamine but retaining the amphetamine salt combinations. This new version received FDA approval in 1996 for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, under a new name, Adderall. This drug, widely prescribed today and consumed by millions of children, adolescents, and adults, represents a paradigmatic example of how compounds developed or widely used by the Nazi regime were subsequently normalized and integrated into conventional medical practice. At the same time, Western and Soviet intelligence services demonstrated sustained interest in the potential of psychoactive substances as tools for mind control, enhanced interrogation, and covert operations. Many of these programs were directly or indirectly inspired by Nazi pharmacological expertise. The most notorious example is Project MKULTRA, a top-secret CIA program launched in the 1950s and continuing into the early 1970s. Later exposed during the Church Committee hearings in the US Senate, this program involved experiments with a wide variety of psychoactive substances, from LSD to various amphetamines, often administered to unwitting or uninformed subjects. Although complete MKULTR, a documentation was destroyed by order of CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, surviving documents indicate a specific interest in chemical interrogation techniques developed by the Gestapo and the SS. Some scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip acted as consultants on aspects of the program. It's important to emphasize that the military use of stimulants was not a practice exclusive to the Third Reich. During World War II, Great Britain, the United States, and Japan all experimented with amphetamines on selected military personnel, primarily pilots and special operations units. The difference lay in scale and systematicity. While the Allies used stimulants selectively and in a limited manner, Nazi Germany had incorporated them as a structural component of its military strategy, distributing them en masse even to regular infantry units. What had begun as a Nazi pharmacological innovation had become, after successive adaptations and recontextualizations, a standardized military practice, implemented with increased medical controls and ethical restrictions. Beyond the military sphere, the pharmacological legacy of the Third Reich raises fundamental questions about the ethics of science and historical responsibility. Much of the data on pharmacological effects, toxicity thresholds, and addiction patterns that underpin the current scientific understanding of methamphetamines originated, at least in part, from observations made during its widespread use under the Nazi regime. This uncomfortable reality has largely been ignored or minimized in the medical and pharmacological literature. Academic texts describing the pharmacosciences or neurological effects of amphetamines rarely mention this historical chapter, preferring to cite modern clinical studies conducted under controlled conditions. However, as medical historians such as Robert J. have pointed out, Lifton and Arthur Kaplan, this selective amnesia raises significant ethical issues. When knowledge derived from ethically indefensible practices is silently incorporated into the accepted scientific corpus, a form of retrospective complicity occurs. This instrumentalization raises disturbing questions that transcend the historical Nazi context. Where do the ethical boundaries of chemical behavior modification lie, whether for military, occupational, or social purposes? What fundamentally distinguishes a Wehrmacht soldier who received Pervitin to maintain his offensive from a contemporary executive who consumes stimulants to maintain his performance during grueling days? The easy answer, that the former served a genocidal regime while the latter operates in a democratic market economy, is insufficient from a profound ethical perspective. In both cases, brain chemistry is altered to overcome natural biological limits and optimize performance according to criteria external to the individual's overall well-being. This parallel is not intended to establish a moral equivalence between radically different historical situations, but rather to underscore how certain patterns of pharmacological instrumentalization have survived the collapse of the regime that implemented them. Pervitin case also illustrates the complex relationship between pharmaceutical innovation and sociopolitics. The same compounds that can function as therapeutic drugs in a controlled clinical setting can become tools of destruction when exploited by totalitarian ideologies or applied without ethical restraints. Pervitin, as a specific compound, has disappeared from modern pharmaceutical formularies. However, its legacy, the idea of the human body as a machine whose performance can and should be chemically optimized, remains deeply rooted in diverse contemporary fields, from medicine to elite sports, from competitive education to corporate culture. This silent persistence of a pattern of thinking that became radicalized under the Nazi regime is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story. What began as an extreme experiment has been normalized, fragmented, and distributed across multiple spheres of contemporary life, becoming less visible but no less influential.